So this is part of the series on aggregate demand and the formula. So just as a reminder, the formula is your consumption plus your investment plus your government expenditure plus your net exports. So within this video, we're going to be looking at consumption. So we're going to be looking at what drives consumption and how important consumption is as a component of aggregate demand and also GDP. So to begin with, what is consumption? So consumption is just based on domestic household spending on goods and services. So as consumers become more confident in the performance of their economy, they're less concerned about saving and their marginal propensity to consume increases. So what that means is as their income starts to rise, they think about, well, what can we do with that money? What can we do with that disposable income? And if they've got a greater confidence in the economy, then they're more likely to spend it on the consumption of goods and services. If they're maybe less confident, then actually they might think about withdrawing it and possibly saving it. Now, it's also important to remember when we're looking at consumption is not an injection into the circular flow of income. Consumption is continuous and it takes place throughout all the different stages. So when, for example, labour, they get that income from their output, that income is expected to be then spent on consumption and it's meant to just spiral around, okay, and just continue to flow. If they decide to save it, that would be considered a withdrawal from the circular flow because they're pulling it out of the natural circulation of that income and consumption. Right, so in terms of how important it is to GDP, it's one of the most significant contributors towards GDP. So as we can see, in 2019, it accounted for 62% of GDP. The UK is... you could argue it's a consumption type of economy. It's an economy that really depends on the consumption of its individuals. And therefore, when we look at the situation, for example, with COVID, you can imagine the knock-on effect of that. With lockdown and shops not being allowed to open, and maybe in some cases you're only dependent on e-commerce and buying online, that is obviously going to restrict consumption, and that's going to have a massive impact on our GDP. And that's probably one of the reasons why we have one of the biggest contractions of GDP out of all the countries in the world, because of how dependent we are on consumption. Now, in some cases, that's good because consumption, it is a sign of confidence. It is a sign of, again, growth in terms of many multinational firms might see the economy of the UK as being attractive simply because they know that consumption does take place and therefore it might encourage foreign direct investment. But the risk of it is when you've got such a big contribution towards GDP, if there is an economic shock of some sort which does impact consumption, then we can imagine how it's going to heavily impact aggregate demand and GDP. Now, what I'm going to show you is I'm going to have a look in terms of context of COVID-19. I'm going to look at exactly how it's impacted consumption within the UK economy. So I'm just going to show you a video now, a news broadcast based on COVID-19 and the impacts of the economy.
Devastating impact that the pandemic is having on business and the economy. The retailer Next has warned that sales could drop by 40%. And Barclays Bank has reported a substantial drop in profits and said that the cost of people defaulting on loans could be more than £2 billion. Our economics editor Faisal Islam has this assessment.
It is a corporate results season like no other. Grim forecasts for the economy coming to life in the accounts of our biggest companies, such as retailer Next, where store sales plunged 52% over the past 3 months, and the company acknowledged it will be some time before shopping returns to normal. And Barclays, one of the UK's largest banks, announcing a 38% fall in profits and warning the pandemic could cost them over £2 billion in bad loans. Its boss questioning whether after the coronavirus, putting thousands of people in office block headquarters would be a thing of the past.
And then 30 minutes into a call, it's just people yelling at each other.
Despite government subsidies, Lubna and hundreds of other Debenhams workers lost their jobs via a conference call when the already struggling retailer went into administration and had to close some stores.
A lot of people are probably scared because they don't know what's going to happen, and it's very unlikely that a lot of people will be able to immediately apply for a job given the current circumstance. For me, I don't know, it was like for me, for example, my exams have been cancelled this year, so I'm unsure whether I'm getting into uni or not. So it just seemed like even more bad news for me, because I was thinking in my head, okay, at least I'll have a job.
There certainly is the same anger amongst many British Airways employees after they announced a dramatic decision to cut 12,000 jobs, judging that the crisis would change this industry forever.
We think that there are alternative solutions, and we think that alternative solutions remain on the table. So we can't understand why BA has started the clock ticking on a consultation for a situation that actually, if we get around the table and have a discussion, could be avoided.
Early hopes that the crisis would be a very sharp blip are starting to fade, particularly in the most affected industries. Empty planes and empty runways mean empty passenger terminals, empty shops and restaurants, empty car parks. And for sectors such as travel, companies are now planning on the basis of a pandemic crisis lasting longer than 2 or 3 months. No instant bounce back in the economy, tough decisions having to be made right now. The government is pouring money into the economy to provide a bridge, but some leading companies on the high streets and in the skies already judging that the other side of this crisis will be a very different place indeed. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
The world's biggest economy, the USA, has recorded its worst growth figures in a decade. During the first quarter of this year, gross domestic product, that's the value of all goods and services produced, fell by 4.8%. Now, as a comparison, in the fourth quarter of last year, before the pandemic, GDP increased by 2.1%. Our North America correspondent, Nick Bright, is in New York with the latest for us.
These figures, Hugh, show what we've already seen with our own eyes, which is the American economy has come to a shuddering halt. And worse is still to come. Some economists believe that the next quarter could see a contraction of 30%, the kind of convulsion that we haven't seen since the 1930s. Now, the Federal Reserve said tonight that it would keep its benchmark interest rate at near zero until the US economy recovers. And governors across America are going to come under heightened pressure to gradually open up the economies. But in cities like New York, that's a risky thing to do. New York is a city caught between dread and desire, desperate to open up after 6 weeks in lockdown, but fearful of the fatal consequences of doing so too soon. A New York without New Yorkers has hammered the economy. Its tourism and hospitality sectors have also been decimated. Wall Street, America's financial hub, fears the onset of another Great Depression. But even though the city is past the peak of its outbreak, the density of its population makes it especially hazardous to quickly open up. That COVID can...
So as you can see from that news broadcast, it's obviously impacted many industries. And these industries are ones that depend on consumption. If you think about the travel industry and not being able to have people from either abroad or domestically to buy their service. If you think about hospitality, not having the ability to actually sit and dine into a restaurant, and think about the high street shops and the retailers that you cannot go into their shops and buy. And especially when we're thinking about this festive period where a lot of these retailers massively depend upon that influx of customers to kind of keep their business and those profits high for the remainder of the year. Now, as I make this video, Arcadia has been all over the news, so that's another retail group that has been massively impacted, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with the likes of Topman and Topshop to see if they do get buyers and they do survive. But we are going to get a lot of casualties because of that decline in consumption. And in terms of how we draw that decline, clearly we're going to be using an ADAS because this whole video is about the aggregate demand formula. And if consumption is fallen, then clearly we will be drawing a AD shift to the left. But in terms of when we're actually drawing this diagram, I think students actually, they miss an opportunity to really use the diagram to evidence and personalise the argument and the analytical argument that they're making. And when we look at it in terms of that shift to the left, we need to consider, well, how far are we going to shift it to the left? If we've got a headline such as the UK enters a recession after GDP is plunged by a record 20.4%, because of that that significant number, and that is ridiculously significant. It's a massive decline in GDP. Then we're thinking, is it just going to be your standard AD shift to the left, or could we really emphasise that shift by creating a really, really significant negative output gap for that quarter? And therefore, we need to think about, okay, what's the potential GDP and where's long-run aggregate supply? Where could we have been potentially operating to begin with our aggregate demand 1, and where's our aggregate demand 2 going to be to show that massive negative output gap? And that's why I'd recommend that when you are using your diagram, really think about how you could draw it and then illustrate it and use it as evidence within your analytical argument. Now, another factor that we can look at, because it's not just based on COVID, clearly consumption is impacted all year round and lots of different situations can cause it. Now, one of the factors that I'm going to look at is in terms of the wealth effect. So the wealth effect is to do with, I suppose, how confident you are feeling and what factors has maybe increased that confidence. So a lot of it is based on your assets. So for example, if the value of your assets rise, you will become, you will feel that you've got more wealth. And when you feel like you've got more wealth, your confidence obviously increases, and then you're more obliged to consume. So as I put here, people spend more as the value of their assets rise. The idea is that consumers feel more financially secure and confident about their wealth when their homes or investment portfolios, and what I mean by that is, for example, if you bought shares into a company, if they rise, then you feel richer. And even if your income hasn't actually changed in terms of, for example, you're not getting an income from your house, depending on the shares and depending on your dividend policy, you might not be getting an income or a great income from the shares that you've bought. But you know that your wealth is increasing because you know that your house is worth more now than it was maybe a year ago. Or you know that the shares that you have bought are rising in value, and therefore when you do decide to sell, you will get more in return. And because of that wealth effect, what we find is actually consumers start to spend more and more, and that's why actually for house owners, we see it as a positive when house prices rise. Maybe not for first-time buyers because they don't have that asset, and therefore it's going to be much more expensive to buy that asset. So even when you're looking at the wealth effect and you're looking at the change in assets and how it might relate to consumption, also think about every individual, their circumstance and situation. Another factor we can look at in terms of this graph that's behind me, this is on Australia at the moment, because Australia have entered one of their first recessions in years and years and years. They weren't really impacted by the Great Recession by much, but COVID, they have been impacted. And we've got the likes of Melbourne and Sydney that have seen their house prices fall drastically, and therefore everything that I said about the wealth effect being positive, you can have a negative wealth effect as well, and that would obviously mean that people are less secure about their finances and they're less confident, and therefore they'll consume less, and that AD will shift to the left. If you're feeling wealthy and feel confident, your AD will shift to the right. Right, okay, another factor that we could look at is in terms of stamp duty. So the UK, they've not necessarily experienced what Australia has experienced with house prices. And one of the reasons is because the government acted pretty fast in terms of trying to incentivise people to still buy houses. Because house prices are obviously influenced by supply and demand. And if you've got high demand for houses, then we'll see house prices rise. And what they did was they discounted, or they created a stamp duty holiday, and stamp duty is the tax on buying that house. So as we can see here, if you're buying a house between £0 and £500,000, then you would not have to pay any stamp duty, which you could probably imagine in majority of geographic areas, that is the norm. And a lot of demographics will be buying houses within that bracket. So that means that actually, if you were thinking of buying and you are in a secure job and you're not necessarily insecure about what's happening with COVID, then this is the perfect time to be buying a house, because it's going to be cheaper because of the discount on stamp duty being absolutely zero. So what we're seeing is actually great demand for houses during a pandemic, during the worst recession we've had in years, which seems strange, but it's because of this government intervention and because of this, obviously, this tax policy that they've intervened with. Another factor that's had an impact is the interest rates. Now, the interest rates have been low for some time. If we think about the Great Recession and how the Bank of England reacted by reducing interest rates, and then that continued during the austerity by the government, when the government tried to cut back their expenditure and tried to pay back that national debt and reduce that budget deficit. Now, that meant that the Bank of England had to take a lot of responsibility in terms of that intervention, and they had to keep interest rates low to make sure the recovery continued. And there's never really been a time where they felt, actually, we can increase interest rates significantly, because the economy has been quite fragile with, for example, Brexit, with the Great Recession, and other factors. And therefore, when we get to this point with COVID, they have reduced interest rates, but because they're already low anyway, they've not been able to reduce them that much. But still, in terms of interest rates being at that point, you can think about it from a point of view, well, how is it going to impact consumption? But more importantly, how is it going to impact savings? And when we look at the household savings ratio, which is the percentage of disposable income that is saved, we have to think about the interest rate. Because if the interest rate is really, really low, then the reward or the return on that saving is going to be very, very minimal or minimalistic. And therefore, there's no encouragement to save. And if you're not going to save, then what are you going to do with your disposable income? Well, you're going to spend it, and you're going to spend it via consumption. So in 2019, the savings ratio was 6.2%. And what we need to think about is, well, how can we compare that? And we'd have to look at other years. We'd have to look in 2020. We'd have to look at what factors could influence that. But usually, again, like I said before, if confidence is high, that savings ratio will be low. Next year, or this year, with COVID, some people might see this as an opportunity to maybe make sure that they are secure for whatever might come their way because of, again, lack of job security. So you might find that the savings ratio does go up, but we are looking at total savings, and that total savings is the disposable income minus your household consumption. And if that's high, then that means consumption is low, and that means AD might shift to the left. If that total savings fall and household savings ratio falls, then that means they're consuming, and if they're consuming, AD will shift to the right.